It was a quiet evening when she was heading home after a long day at work. She had always enjoyed the drive back to her apartment, a time to unwind and think. The streets were almost empty, and the only sounds were the soft hum of her car's engine and the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. As she made her way through the familiar neighborhood, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. The day had been stressful, but this time in her car, by herself, always gave her a sense of peace. However, that calm was shattered in an instant. Out of nowhere, the bright blue and red lights of a police car flashed behind her. She blinked, unsure if she was seeing things right, but when the siren went off, she quickly pulled over to the side of the road, her heart beginning to race. She had been stopped by officers before, but something about this felt different. She couldn't place it, but her instincts told her something wasn't right. She rolled down her window, preparing herself for the usual exchange. She had always been taught to stay calm in these situations, especially being a woman of color. Over the years, she'd become accustomed to the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, ways she was treated differently when interacting with the police. It was something she had learned to navigate, to remain composed no matter what. The officer approached her car, his boots tapping loudly against the pavement as he came closer. She could see his badge gleaming in the streetlight, and the stern look on his face made her stomach tighten. He stopped right at her window and gave her a quick, almost dismissive glance before leaning down to speak to her. "License and registration," he said curtly, his voice cold. She nodded and quickly fumbled through her glove compartment, pulling out her documents and handing them over. She could feel his gaze on her, scanning her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable, but she did her best to ignore it, keeping her voice steady when she responded. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, trying to sound as polite as possible. The officer didn't answer at first. Instead, he glanced at her license and then back at her with a raised eyebrow. "Where are you coming from, ma'am?" His tone had shifted slightly, no longer as polite but more probing. It wasn't uncommon for officers to ask where she had been, but the way he said it made her uneasy. "Just work," she replied. "I'm heading home now." He didn't seem satisfied with her answer. "Late night for you, huh?" She tried not to feel irritated. "I work in a hospital," she said, hoping that would explain the late hours. But the officer's expression only darkened further. He leaned in a little closer, his face now inches from hers, the smell of his cologne mixed with the faint scent of cigarette smoke that lingered around him. "I'm sure you know how things work around here," he said, his words deliberate, almost as though he was testing her. "A little bribe can go a long way when it comes to getting out of a ticket. You wouldn't want this to be more than just a simple stop, would you?" She froze for a second, processing what he had just said. A bribe. Her mind raced and she could feel her pulse quicken. Was this really happening? She hadn't said anything yet, and the officer didn't seem to care about her silence. He continued, leaning even closer to the window. "I mean, I could just let you off the hook if you understand what I'm saying," he said, his eyes flicking back to the papers in his hand. His tone was now laced with something darker, something more menacing. She didn't know how to respond. This wasn't the kind of conversation she was used to having with the police. Her hand gripped the steering wheel tighter as she tried to process the situation. Her mind raced back to all the stories she had heard of people in similar situations, black people who were harassed, treated unfairly, sometimes even hurt by officers who held this kind of power, and now here she was in the same spot. She was alone, and this officer was making a demand that was both illegal and immoral. She couldn't just let it slide, but she also knew the consequences of speaking out immediately. She had heard enough horror stories to know how quickly things could escalate. She tried to keep her voice steady, though her words were now laced with a calm defiance. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, refusing to meet his gaze any longer. "I'm just trying to go home." For a moment, the officer seemed to study her, his face unreadable. He let out a deep breath, almost as if he were deciding whether to press further or let it go. But the moment of tension didn't last long. The officer stepped back from her car, looking at the street around them. He didn't seem to be in a hurry, as though he were trying to decide whether to escalate the situation. She held her breath, praying he would just let it go, let her go. Instead, he took a step back toward her car, his hand coming down on the side of the vehicle with a sharp smack. Without warning, he slammed his fist into the side mirror, shattering the glass. She jumped, startled by the sudden violence. The mirror hung there for a moment, barely attached, as shards of glass rained down onto the road. Her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't believe what was happening. He had just smashed her window. Now we're talking, the officer sneered. His eyes burned with a kind of fury that made her heart race in fear. Next time, maybe you'll think twice before crossing me. She couldn't stay silent any longer. Fear surged within her, but so did anger. How dare he? How dare he do this to her, to anyone? He had crossed a line, and she knew she couldn't just let him get away with it. The officer took a step back, but instead of continuing his rant, he froze when he noticed the flashing lights of another patrol car approaching from behind. Her heart skipped a beat, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. Someone else was coming. Someone who might be able to make this stop. The officer who had stopped her didn't seem happy about the approaching car. He quickly moved away from her window, as if he wanted to avoid whatever confrontation was about to happen. She glanced at the rearview mirror, hoping for some sign of help. The second officer's vehicle stopped behind hers, and the officer who had just smashed her window glanced over his shoulder. The second officer stepped out, and immediately his expression shifted. He looked at her for a moment, then at the damage to her car, and his eyes widened in surprise. For the first time since the stop had begun, the officer who had harassed her looked uncertain. He seemed to realize who she was, as if the presence of the second officer had suddenly made him aware of the gravity of the situation. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, unsure of what would happen next. But one thing was clear, this wasn't going to end quietly. She had already decided that she wasn't going to let this slide. As the second officer stepped out of his car, the tension in the air seemed to shift. The first officer quickly stepped back from her vehicle, adjusting his uniform as though trying to distance himself from the chaos he had just caused. He didn't meet the second officer's eyes, instead glancing nervously around, almost like a child caught doing something wrong. The officer's unease was apparent, and she could see the fear in his eyes, a fear that wasn't there when he had initially approached her. The second officer, a man in his early 30s, looked confused for a moment as he took in the scene before him. His gaze flickered from her shattered window to the officer who had been harassing her, and back again. He clearly recognized something wasn't right, but he didn't jump to conclusions. He didn't immediately confront the first officer. Instead, he gave her a polite nod and turned his attention to the man beside her car. The first officer, still trying to regain his composure, finally spoke. This woman was refusing to cooperate. I was just trying to do my job. The second officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he continued to study both of them. He took in the broken glass on the ground, the officer's aggressive stance, and then he looked at her. Her calm, unwavering demeanor despite the damage to her car and the threat hanging over her. Something about her, maybe the way she was holding herself, made him pause. He had seen people in situations like this before, but there was something different this time. She wasn't scared. She wasn't shaking as most people would be in her position. He finally spoke, his voice firm but not unkind. Why don't you step back for a moment? He said to the officer who had caused the damage. I'll handle this from here. The first officer opened his mouth to protest but seemed to think better of it. He hesitated, his eyes darting back and forth, then reluctantly stepped away, walking toward the back of the patrol car. He didn't say another word, but his eyes never left the woman in the car, as if waiting for something. The second officer turned to her. Are you okay? He asked, his voice softer now. She nodded slowly, still in shock from what had just happened. I'm fine, she said, though her voice betrayed a slight tremor. I just didn't expect this, I understand. I'm sorry this happened. I'm going to take care of this, he said, his expression serious. He glanced back at the first officer, his gaze hardening for a moment before he turned back to her. Can you tell me what happened? She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She could still feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, but she knew she needed to keep her head clear. She recounted the events as calmly as she could, explaining how the officer had demanded a bribe and how things had escalated when she refused to comply. Her words came out in a steady stream, each one more difficult to say than the last. I told him I wasn't going to pay a bribe, she said, her voice quieter now. And then he just smashed the window. I don't know why he did that. The second officer listened intently, nodding as she spoke. He didn't interrupt her, didn't make excuses for the other officer. When she finished, he remained silent for a few moments, absorbing the weight of what she had just shared. "This officer," he said, his voice measured, "has been a problem for some time. He's known for using his position to bully people, especially people of color. We've had complaints about him before, but nothing like this." She felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard rumors about officers using their power to manipulate others, but she had never imagined something like this would happen to her. It was a wake-up call, one she hadn't been ready for but couldn't ignore. "Is he going to get away with this?" she asked, her voice tinged with frustration. She had to know. She had to hear it from him, to know that someone in this uniform would stand up against the injustice. The second officer's expression darkened. "No, he won't. I'll make sure of it." He paused, glancing once more at the first officer, who was still standing near his patrol car, clearly avoiding eye contact. "I'm going to report this immediately." But even as he said it, she couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't going to be that simple. She had seen enough of the system to know that the wheels of justice didn't always turn in the way people hoped. She knew that things would get messy, that her involvement would make it even harder to find resolution. But she wasn't going to back down now. Not after what she had just experienced. Not after everything that had happened. "Thank you," she said, her voice firm this time. "But I don't want to be brushed aside. I'm not going to let this slide. Not just for me, but for everyone else who has been treated like this." The officer looked at her for a moment, his eyes full of understanding. He nodded slowly. "I can promise you this. I'm not going to let this go either." She felt a flicker of hope, but it was fleeting. The reality was that no matter how hard she tried, no matter how much she wanted to trust in the system, there would always be that doubt in the back of her mind. The doubt that justice would be swept under the rug, ignored, forgotten. The second officer pulled out his radio and began speaking in a low voice, making sure to relay the details of the incident. She didn't catch all of it, but she could hear the urgency in his words. She was relieved that the situation was being taken seriously, but she knew this was only the beginning. "Can I see your ID?" he asked, pulling his gaze from the radio. She reached into her purse and handed him her driver's license, her hands still a little shaky. He glanced at it, then back at her. When he saw her name, his eyes widened ever so slightly, but he quickly masked it with a professional expression. "Is there anything else I can do for you right now?" he asked, handing back her ID. She considered his question. "I don't know," she said quietly. I'm just trying to process everything that's happened. I've never been in a situation like this before." He nodded in understanding. "Take your time. I'll make sure everything is handled properly from here. We'll get a report filed, and this officer will be held accountable. I can't promise it'll be easy, but I'll make sure it's not swept under the rug." She felt a small measure of comfort in his words, but the nagging feeling that this wouldn't be as straightforward as he made it sound still lingered. She didn't know what the next step would be, but she was more determined than ever to see this through. This wasn't just about her. This was about the countless others who had been in her shoes, who had been targeted and harassed, but had never had the courage to speak out. "Thank you," she said again, her voice quieter this time, more sincere. The officer gave a small, reassuring smile. "No problem. I'm just doing my job. But if you need anything, don't hesitate to reach out." She nodded, but as he turned to speak with the first officer, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just taken an unexpected turn. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. As the second officer began taking control of the situation, she could feel the weight of what had just happened pressing down on her. Her mind was still racing, trying to process everything. She had always known that the system wasn't perfect, but this experience had shattered any illusions she had left. She had heard of corruption and abuse within law enforcement, but now she had lived it. The officer who had caused the damage stood a few feet away, his posture rigid and defensive. He was trying to act as though nothing had happened, as though he hadn't just crossed a line he shouldn't have. His face remained unreadable, but his hands were clenched tightly at his sides. She could sense his discomfort, but it didn't matter anymore. Nothing could erase what he had done. The second officer, still on the radio, glanced over at her briefly. She saw the way his expression softened when he noticed her gaze. She wasn't sure if it was out of sympathy or genuine concern, but it made her feel slightly more at ease. For the first time since the stop, someone seemed to care about what had happened. He wasn't brushing it off. He wasn't just following protocol to check a box. After a few moments, he put the radio down and approached her again, this time with a look of determination. His eyes met hers, and for a brief second, she saw something more than just a police officer in them. There was a sense of resolve there, a promise that he wouldn't let this go. "I've reported this and I've requested backup," he said, his voice steady. "The department is going to take this seriously. We'll make sure there's an investigation into this officer's conduct." She didn't know how to respond. Part of her wanted to believe him, to think that the system could work and that this officer's actions wouldn't be brushed aside. But the other part of her, the part that had seen too much injustice in her life, felt a sense of dread. She had heard the stories of people who had tried to hold officers accountable, only to be silenced, ignored, or worse. The officer seemed to read the skepticism on her face. He paused for a moment, clearly understanding her doubts. "I know it doesn't feel like much right now," he said softly, "but I want you to know this won't be swept under the rug. I'll make sure of it." For a moment, she simply stared at him, unsure of what to say. Part of her wanted to scream, to shout at him to do more, to make sure this didn't end up like all the other cases of police misconduct that had been forgotten over time. But she held back. She didn't want to make things harder than they already were. She needed to stay calm. "I appreciate that," she said finally, her voice quieter than she intended. "I just don't want him to get away with this. No one should have to go through what I just did." The officer nodded. "You're right. No one should." There was a long silence between them as the weight of the situation hung in the air. It was as if the world had slowed down, and in that moment everything felt uncertain. What would happen next? Would the system actually hold the officer accountable? Or would this just be another case of someone abusing their power, with no real consequences? Before she could voice any more of her concerns, she heard footsteps behind her. The first officer had moved away from his patrol car and was now standing near the second officer, waiting for further instructions. He seemed unusually quiet, almost as though he were waiting for something. She couldn't help but notice that he was avoiding her gaze. "Look, I know this is awkward," the second officer said, breaking the silence. "But I need to ask you a few more questions." She nodded, knowing it was necessary. "Go ahead." He took a step back, giving her space as he began speaking. "Can you tell me exactly what happened from the moment he pulled you over? I need to get a detailed account for the report." She took a deep breath and began recounting everything, from the moment she had first seen the officer's lights flashing in her rear-view mirror to the moment he smashed the window. It was hard to relive the events, but she forced herself to stay composed as she spoke. Each detail seemed more unreal than the last. "When he first approached the car," she started, "he asked for my license and registration, just like any other stop. But then, it wasn't just routine. He started making comments, asking where I was coming from, why I was out so late. He didn't seem interested in anything other than questioning me. Then, when I refused to give him a bribe, he just snapped." Her voice faltered for a moment as she recalled the officer's anger and the sudden violence that followed. She didn't have to describe the way he had slammed his fist into her car. The second officer had already seen the damage. He smashed the window, and that's when I realized this wasn't just about a ticket anymore. This was about power. He was using his badge to intimidate me, to make me fear him. The second officer listened carefully, jotting down notes on his notepad. His face remained serious, but she could see the anger in his eyes as she spoke. This wasn't just a job for him, it was personal. "I believe you," he said finally, looking up from his notes. "I know this officer, and I've had concerns about his behavior for a while. He's been a problem, but this is crossing a line." She nodded, her anger rising again. "I don't care what he's done before. He needs to face the consequences. I don't want anyone else to go through what I just did." The second officer gave her a sympathetic look, but there was something else in his eyes too. It was determination. "We'll make sure of that. You have my word." She wasn't sure what to make of his promise. He seemed genuine, but how many times had she heard similar promises from people in power, only to see them ignored when the dust settled? She wanted to trust him, to believe that this time would be different, but her years of experience had taught her to be cautious. She couldn't afford to get her hopes up too high. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. She felt as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders, but she also knew that the hardest part was still to come. Just then, the second officer spoke again, this time with a note of finality in his voice. "I'm going to need you to come down to the station with me. We need to file an official report. and I want to make sure you're taken care of. We'll take it from here." For the first time since the incident began, she felt a spark of hope. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe, just maybe, things would change. But even as she followed the officer to his car, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a long, difficult journey. The road ahead would be anything but easy. But one thing was certain: she wasn't going to back down. The ride to the police station felt strangely quiet. The officer didn't say much as they drove, his focus clearly on the road ahead. She sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, her mind running through everything that had happened. Her heart was still racing, her thoughts a whirlwind. It was one thing to hear about injustice, to read about it in the news, but to experience it firsthand, it was something else entirely. She wasn't sure what she expected when she agreed to come to the station. A part of her had hoped the situation would be resolved quickly, that the officer who had harassed her would face immediate consequences. But deep down she knew that was probably too much to hope for. The system was slow, and in cases like this, where the stakes were high, things rarely moved quickly. The officer kept his eyes on the road, but she noticed him glance at her from time to time. He probably wanted to say something, to offer words of comfort, but he knew better than to try. She wasn't in the mood for reassurance. What she needed was action, not sympathy. When they arrived at the station, the officer led her inside, nodding to a few of his colleagues as they passed. The building felt cold, sterile, and impersonal, nothing like the warmth of home she had hoped to return to that night. She was led into a small room, a narrow space with a single table and a few chairs. It wasn't much, just a simple place to file paperwork. But the weight of the moment felt heavy in the air. This was where things would start, where the investigation would begin. The officer told her to sit, then took a seat across from her. He pulled out a file from his bag, opening it to reveal a stack of forms. "We'll get everything on the record here," he said, his tone professional but kind. "It's important that we get every detail right." She nodded, her nerves settling slightly. The process was starting, but it still didn't feel real. She thought about her conversation with her husband earlier that evening. She had told him about the encounter, about the officer demanding a bribe, about the window being smashed. When she had first described the incident to him, he had been furious. He hadn't said much afterward, but she knew he would do whatever he could to make sure the situation was handled appropriately. She just wasn't sure what that meant anymore. The officer across from her began asking questions. She answered each one as best as she could, recalling every detail of the evening's events. Her hands were still shaking slightly, but she kept her voice steady. She didn't want to come across as emotional or overly dramatic. She had learned that people tended to dismiss those who showed too much emotion, especially when it came to cases like hers. As she recounted the officer's actions, the officer, writing down her words, paused every so often to ask for clarification. Each question made her relive the night's events all over again. She didn't like it, but she understood that it was necessary. If anything was going to change, if there was going to be justice, the details needed to be clear. When she finished, the officer looked up from his notes. "I'll make sure this gets to the right people," he said, his voice steady. "I'll make sure an internal investigation is launched immediately. The department can't afford to let this slide." Her heart sank. The words sounded so familiar, so hollow. She had heard similar promises before. She had heard the stories of people trying to get justice only to be met with excuses, delays, and bureaucratic red tape. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to think that this time things would be different. But she couldn't shake the doubt that lingered in the back of her mind. "You said the officer has been a problem before," she said, looking directly at him. "What does that mean? How bad has it gotten?" The officer hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing his words. He let out a sigh before answering. "There have been complaints, more than a few. He's been known to use his power to intimidate people, to bend the rules when it suits him. Some people have tried to file complaints before, but he's always managed to cover his tracks, and the department hasn't taken action." She listened carefully, trying to understand what that meant for her case. "So this isn't the first time he's done something like this?" "No," the officer said, his voice low. "But this is different. This is an abuse of power in the worst way possible. It's going to get the attention it deserves." But again, there was that lingering doubt. She had heard similar things from other officers, other people who had promised action only to fall short when it counted. She didn't want to be cynical, but she couldn't ignore the reality of the situation. "You're sure?" she asked, her voice catching slightly. "You're sure something will be done about him?" The officer met her gaze, his expression serious. "I promise you we'll get to the bottom of this. He won't get away with it." She nodded slowly, but even as she did, the uncertainty gnawed at her. Would the officer really face consequences, or would he continue to use his badge to intimidate and harass others, just as he had with her? There was a long silence in the room as she sat there, her mind filled with questions. The officer, sensing her thoughts, spoke again. "I know you're frustrated, I get it, but you're doing the right thing." Not many people would come forward in a situation like this. She didn't answer right away. The truth was, she didn't feel brave. She didn't feel like she was doing the right thing. She felt like a small part of a much bigger, much more complicated system, one that was deeply flawed and resistant to change. But she couldn't stop now. She couldn't back down, no matter how much the system seemed stacked against her. She had to see this through. For her community, for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly by the very people who were supposed to protect them. The officer stood up and walked to the door. "I'll get these reports filed right away," he said, glancing back at her. "It'll take time, but we'll get it done." She nodded again, but as he left the room, a new wave of emotions washed over her. She felt a mixture of hope and fear, both at war with each other. Would this really be the turning point? Or was this just another case of things falling through the cracks? As she sat there alone in the room, she couldn't help but think about the officer who had harassed her. What would happen to him? Would he lose his job? Would he face charges for what he did? Or would this all be swept under the rug just like so many other cases before it? It was hard to know what the future held, but one thing was certain. This wasn't the end. She was determined to make sure of that. Days turned into weeks, and she found herself anxiously waiting for updates. The process seemed slower than she had anticipated, and each passing day felt like an eternity. The officer who had been involved in the incident had been suspended, but she knew that didn't guarantee anything. She had heard of suspensions before, only for things to return to normal once the dust settled. The thought gnawed at her, and she often found herself lost in thought, wondering if this would be one of those cases where the system failed. But she couldn't just sit and wait. She had already come so far, and now she was more determined than ever to make sure that her voice was heard. She wasn't just going to let it go. Not after everything that had happened, not after everything that officer had done, and especially not after learning that there had been others like her. People who had been harassed, targeted, and silenced by the same man. Her husband, the police chief, had promised her that he would take action. He had been working behind the scenes, quietly putting pressure on the department to address the issue. But even he seemed cautious. He understood how deeply ingrained the problems were, how much power the system held, and he also understood that taking on an officer like the one involved wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't just about right or wrong. It was about challenging a system that had been in place for years, maybe even decades. She could sense her husband's frustration, even when he didn't speak about it. He had always been a man of integrity, but the weight of his position sometimes felt like a constant battle. He wanted to help her, to fix what had happened, but the reality of his role in the department often left him feeling helpless. He couldn't just act without consequences. He had to be strategic, careful about the moves he made. One afternoon, she was sitting at home, scrolling through her phone, when she received a call from the second officer, the one who had first arrived on the scene that night. She had almost forgotten about him, but when she saw his name on the screen, a wave of relief washed over her. She had been waiting for an update, and finally it seemed like something was happening. "Hello?" she answered, trying to steady her voice. "Hi," the officer said, his tone more serious than she expected. "I wanted to update you on the investigation." She sat up a little straighter, her heart pounding. "What's going on? Has there been any progress?" "I've spoken to the Internal Affairs Unit," he began. "They've launched a full investigation into the officer involved. They've interviewed several witnesses who have had similar encounters with him, and they're working on gathering evidence. It's not an easy process, but I can tell you that they're taking it seriously." Her breath caught in her throat. "Really? You're sure?" "I'm positive," he said. "This isn't just going to be swept under the rug. The department can't afford the kind of publicity this case would bring if it's ignored. There's too much at stake." For the first time in weeks, she felt a spark of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. I don't want to get my hopes up, she said, her voice trembling slightly. But if they're really investigating, if something is finally being done, I need to know it's going to be enough. The officer's voice softened. I understand. I know this is hard. But we're making progress step by step. I've seen how things can be buried, how people can be silenced. But I promise you, this time is different. People are paying attention. The pressure is on. Her heart still raced, but she found herself holding on to his words. Maybe this time it would be different. She wasn't the only one who wanted justice. There were others, other officers, other community members who were also invested in seeing that the right thing was done. Thank you, she said quietly. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, he replied. I'll keep you updated as things move forward. Just know that you're not alone in this. She hung up the phone, the weight on her chest lifting slightly. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but the tide seemed to be turning. She felt a renewed sense of determination. She wasn't going to stop until she saw justice, until she knew that the officer who had wronged her and so many others would be held accountable. The next few weeks were filled with more waiting, more uncertainty, but also more moments of hope. The investigation continued, and more people came forward with their stories. She spoke with several other individuals who had been targeted by the officer, each one telling a similar tale of intimidation, harassment, and abuse of power. They all wanted justice just like she did, but what stood out the most was the sense of unity that began to form among them. They weren't alone anymore. They had each other, and together they could make a difference. Then one day everything changed. The officer who had been suspended, the one who had smashed her window, was officially fired. The department had made its decision, and the investigation had revealed enough evidence to confirm the allegations against him. He would no longer wear the badge. She received the news late in the afternoon, her phone buzzing with a message from the second officer. He had kept his promise. It was over. The officer who had caused her so much pain, who had abused his power, had been removed from the force. For a moment, she couldn't believe it. It felt surreal, like a dream. She had expected this process to take months, maybe even years, but here it was. The officer had been held accountable. The system, it seemed, could work when the right people were willing to fight for change. But even as she processed the news, she knew it wasn't just about one officer. It was about the bigger picture. This wasn't just a victory for her. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been targeted, for everyone who had been silenced. The work wasn't over. The system still needed to change. But this was a step in the right direction. The department issued a public statement acknowledging the officer's misconduct and promising to make reforms. They vowed to improve training, to hold their officers accountable, and to build better relationships with the community. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. She sat down with her husband that evening, the weight of everything finally sinking in. They didn't say much, but there was a shared understanding between them. He had supported her every step of the way, but now they both knew that the fight was far from over. There would be more challenges, more battles to fight, but together, they would face them. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a moment of peace. She had been through something unimaginable, but she had come out on the other side stronger. She wasn't just the victim of an abusive officer. She was a catalyst for change, and that, she realized, was something worth fighting for.